In this episode of Cube FM, we're back with our previous guest, David Petch. And this time we're unpacking a real-world DevOps scenario where a complex GitLab CI/CD pipeline integrated with Argo CD was outpaced by a simple FTP deployment. We'll walk through what went wrong, from container builds and Helm chart delays to Argo CD sync bottlenecks, and explore why sometimes operational simplicity still wins. The story highlights issues like image version mismatches, lagging reconciliations, and the overhead of declarative automation. We'll also touch on the trade-offs between visibility, auditability, and raw deployment speed. Stay tuned as we look at the technical friction behind modern Kubernetes delivery. David also shared some great insights about how the adoption of new technologies works in his home country of the Czech Republic. This episode of Cube FM is sponsored by LearnK8s. Since 2017, LearnK8s has provided trainings all over the world to help Kubernetes engineers level up. Courses are instructor-led, they're given online as well as in person to individuals or also to groups. Students have access to course materials for the rest of their lives. And if you'd like more information, go check out learnk8s.io. Now, let's get into the episode. David, welcome back to Cube FM. Very nice to have you with us. How are you doing today?
Hello, it's nice to be here again. I'm doing great. Thank you. The weather is nice. I like it.
Good. Now, what are 3 emerging Kubernetes tools that you're keeping an eye on?
Well, recently I've been installing Kyverno in production. So it seems that I like it a lot, to be honest, and I was surprised how easy it is. The next thing is, of course, Cloud Native PG. I'm watching it all the time, and recently there was some very interesting split brain bug that I can refer to that seems that might bump this project another way further, another level, maybe even further, which is perfect from my perspective. Also, recently I've discovered that in the K9s, like the CLI that you typically use for the Kubernetes, there are a lot of more key shortcuts and options that I was not aware of. So it seems like learning Vim over again, for partially at least. So
Wonderful.
There are always some projects in Kubernetes ecosystem that you can spend time with.
It's good. Good to see that you're busy, very active. And, we had you once on the podcast before, but just for a quick introduction, can you tell our audience about what you do and where you work?
Okay. So currently I work at Vrike. I work with the infrastructure, and it's kind of a combination between the, let's say, infrastructure guy and also some Java developer, because I also help with the team that is able to connect through the JDBC libraries to the Postgres databases or to Kafka services, RabbitMQs, etc. Because the company is so large that we have our own set of libraries. So typically, if you would like to onboard an application, you can get, let's say, some starting template and also some libraries that solve the, I would say, hard problems, typically, effectively, for free. And also I see it from the infrastructure perspective, so it is a very welcome link, I would say.
And I also understand that you are quite certified when it comes to CNCF certifications. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I can. So currently I've earned a new badge, and it's called the Golden Cube Surround. So I don't know if folks are already familiar with it, but at that point I got all the CNCF certifications, and it was kind of an interesting journey, I would say, and I'm still not sure or struggling a little bit myself that if this is useful or or not, especially in the trenches, to be honest, because a lot of those certifications are multiple choice questions, for example, and I can imagine that for a lot of employers it's not that significant. But on the other hand, for example, the Kubernetes related ones, like CKA, CKS, for example, they are very relevant, and I'm looking actually for getting recertified with certain of them soon, to be honest. So it is even very welcomed as a refresher. So for some of the knowledge and some of the new features that are in Kubernetes along in this 3 years or so.
Very good. And since you said one of the emerging tools you're keeping an eye on is that you recently installed Kyverno in production. I also understand there's a Kyverno certification that's come out recently, right?
Yes. There is a certification, and I can definitely conclude that it was useful because my process is that I like going over the documentation of the project. So for Kyverno especially, I would say it's very welcoming, it's very easy to understand, and there are a lot of options, a lot of examples. So the certification process, especially not the certification, maybe exam itself, but learning for the certification was very useful to me.
And obviously, you're quite into cloud native, given the amount of time you've spent, certifying and also considering getting recertified. How did your cloud native journey start?
Well, originally, a few years back, I started with AWS, mostly around Lambdas, and we were running, or we are still actually running some Scala services as Lambdas. So there are some challenges if you would like to run, let's say, a typical Java application that is slow to start, that is, let's say, bulky from the memory perspective. So you need a lot of tooling around. Then we use AWS Aurora, which is I would say another prequel to the cloud native, because even when you use it as a service, when you have this approach that you are able to clone it easily and experiment, for example, on another instance and not on your production, this is all, let's say, from my perspective, lesson or day zero, so to say. So my actual journey has started with the Docker and Docker Compose, especially, of course. And through the Docker and some basic container, we've used Docker Swarm for our first applications. Which was very welcomed. And to be honest, at that time, like maybe it was 5-6 years ago, I've preferred this much over Kubernetes because of the simplicity. But then eventually we hit some, let's say, limitations of the technology, and we were kind of forced to move to Kubernetes. And then I did a lot of certifications, a lot of looking around, because, when I've started, I was under the impression that I don't understand Kubernetes. I started reading books, for example, and after, I don't know, 20 books, I'm still not positive that I understand Kubernetes much, but at least my experience is significantly better than it used to be, and it is the space that there is always something to learn, something new that can challenge you, that you can mess up in the production, or you should tune at least, or something in this direction. So I like it very much. And currently, I am in the company when we run in the US, in EU, several data centers on-prem with a lot of stuff inside. So I can describe this in depth, but a lot of technologies and a lot of those certifications and the process itself, I would say I can use 60% of it in my real day job, which is fantastic.
Very good. And so you've taken a step, further back from when you got into cloud native. What were you before cloud native? What kind of technologies were you working with in the past?
Oh, you can imagine me starting as a typical Java developer, or maybe even recently, more more in depth into the past. I started with Visual Basics number 6. Probably not many people remember it, and I was very keen to switch into .NET version 1.0, not the .NET Core, but .NET. At that point, so this is, let's say, very decades old experience. I would say something like this. I've had some experience also from the management. It was kind of a detour for me, of course, in software engineering, let's say. And then I think that currently the infrastructure is the most interesting place to be to, because the problems, at least at my scale, at the companies that I know of, seems to be very interesting, and they are still growing, I would say, which is perfect.
You mentioned a couple things already in terms of books and obviously the certification process, but what works best for you in order to stay up to date with all the changes that are going on in the Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem?
Well, I guess that given my lookout here, or how many technologies I would like to follow, I'm definitely not able to keep track for all of them. So there are several, I would say, up to 5, which I try to follow closely. Of course, especially core Kubernetes. I mentioned, for example, Cloud Native PG and some other projects. And I really look at the changelogs, and I really follow them, I don't know, on LinkedIn or somewhere, to see if there is a new version, to see what was fixed, what new feature there is, or what they are even considering in the GitHub. So I try to be, let's say, quite close with those. Then for me, mostly it is around the Sun conference attendance. So I like Cloud Native Rejects the most, probably. And of course, the KubeCon seems like a good choice for, let's say, annual visit. So there are a lot of talks that are, I would say, very, or the audience differs very widely. So we can really select, always try something new. So recently I was even for some, for example, a Gang workload scheduling, which seems to be kind of a big deal when you do this machine learning stuff at scale, etc., which I'm not very familiar with. So typically this works well for me, I guess.
And if you could go back and share one career tip with your younger self, what would it be?
Sometimes I would say too hard on myself. So I can remember the time when I was running Gentoo Linux. I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but one of the properties it has is that you compile everything on your own on the machine. And it was very time consuming to like compile whole kernel, every library that there is, possibly with every update. But at the same time, I've learned a lot. But this experience, I think I could, for example, omit in the future and save a lot of time in my next life, I would say.
With that being said, we want to jump into, our core focus of today, which is part of our monthly content discovery. We found an article series. You wrote, "All my DevOps pipelines from GitLab commit to Argo CD got beaten by FTP." So you encountered an interesting challenge when supporting a PHP team after a company merger. Can you tell us about the contrasting approaches to cloud technologies between the two companies that collided in this situation?
Well, first of all, I need to have some kind of a disclaimer that I was involved in this. You can, from my opinions, probably clearly see at which company, but I want to emphasize that this is like not meant to be criticism. These are really different approaches, and I think that both of them are valid. They have like some place and time in the space and in the with the people, I would say. And I really am not criticizing, or even though I prefer one of them, I'm not criticizing the other that it is not valid, because I have also used it maybe more significantly in the past, but still I was there also, so I can understand even the other perspective. So the companies, let's say that they are named Company A and the Company B. So Company A is being the larger in the merger, and the Company B is being merged into Company A. So Company A is having some kind of legacy PHP application with no framework, and it is focused on, let's say, small applications and very fast delivery. So there are a lot of clients. They just want to have the implementation done. Typically, they have deployment through FTP, so they just zip or tarball everything and throw it away to some FTP. So the, let's say, IT person in the company can deploy it on some Windows ISS or IIS. Sorry, what is the Internet something server? And that's it, basically. And the Company B has a completely different approach. They run on Kubernetes, they have Argo CD, they do everything through GitOps, they have extensive use of GitLab, etc., etc. And they basically, when I like thought about it, they differ almost in every possible way. So the Company B, for example, does not have many small projects. They run just a few projects, but they are long-term. They focus on the SLAs. The Company A needs just to have the implementation, let's say, the first implementation done. Then they have very limited support. The Company B, on the other hand, needs to run the thing. Typically, they also serve the SLA or help at least with it. Also, the companies are like paid differently. So the Company A is paid by the implementation, and this is a one-off thing. The Company B has those long-term SLA contracts, so it is, let's say, paid. And of course, the incidents matter there, I would say. So you can of course imagine that the customers differs. For Company A, those are typically small ones or medium-sized, and they don't have any experience with larger ones. For the Company B, those are just large customers. They even differ in their cultural approach. So the Company A prefers to have everyone on site all the time. The Company B is running mostly remote. And of course, there was a smart idea to merge these two teams together, right? Why not?
Now, one of the aspects I would say stands out the most in your story is how Company A's approach contrasted with modern cloud native principles. Could you elaborate on their legacy PHP development approach and how it compared to containerized application delivery?
Mhm. Okay, so what did the Company A had at the time? They had a basically custom PHP application without any framework to start with. So you cannot introduce something like Laravel or basically any like Symfony or any other project. So everything from the top to bottom was custom built at the time. There was, of course, one person in the circle or in the middle circle that was in charge, and others were not much challenging, let's say, the architect of it. As it is currently the homegrown solution, you can imagine that it has several layers, and of course the customizations were not very well thought through. So I would say that the base was meant to be MVC, but in the views you could also trigger some logic, and this was, for example, very problematic. It was not object-oriented at all. It was all based on the functions, which was very interesting because on the one hand, it was very easy to understand. The flow was typically much easier than you can see in many, for example, Java applications in comparison. But the logic was also very heavily depending on function exists. So you could override basically any functions that there were, but you could not, for example, wrap the functions inside each other, or there were some limitations like this. So when you did some copying and pasting, it was very fine, but as the layers evolved, it was difficult for the extensions, which I will talk later on, to keep up. So you had a, let's say, core component, and typically the customer was provided with something like extra on top of it, which they call something like customization, or we can call it extension, any way you like. So basically you have added a bench of other PHP files that were basically overriding something in the core, and it was that easy. So you can really imagine something like C level approach that from the old days or something like this. One thing that was very significant here is that they didn't access the database directly, but the whole company was based on the large ERP system, which was primarily, let's say, for the data perspective. And this framework was just querying through some custom API, not REST, I can tell you that, and not touching the database. And of course, like if the customers claimed that the main advantage of the ERP system is to have a single database ruling it all. I mean, ruling it all meaning that it could cover basically everything from your company accounting to manufacturing to also running your e-commerce site. Technically, it was not that easy to do, and this PHP application needed to have a Redis caching layer. So basically everything that was like pulled from the API was cached later on in a, let's say, similar way that the API was designed. So this was another level of complexity that basically from the data perspective, you need to very well understand how the API worked. And the API was, of course, not designed or modeled around what the website needed. It was much more like a CRUD model that is typical or something like this. Also, I need to emphasize that one key thing is that the team did lack some operational experience, because once they like created the application, they threw it over the wall to someone other running it. So they had very limited feedback if the application is performing well. And of course, if you combine it with the fact that the customers are typically small, there was even maybe not a reason for the application to be tuned or something like this. So for example, for the observability perspective, even though it's very harsh to say it, there was no observability except for some error log in Postgres or something like this.
From a cloud native perspective, there were several concerning practices in what you described. What specific challenges did you identify in Company A's approach that would make Kubernetes adoption difficult?
Well, there are many of them. I would say that it is difficult for the customers to understand what is happening, because if you are in this traditional boat that you receive, let's say, zip patches, so each update is a new zip patch for you. It contains just a few files that you patch, like replace in your installation, something in this direction. It's kind of very difficult to imagine that the customer would go to something so sophisticated as Kubernetes running in his own environment. So this is first thing to mention. Also, if you have a product that is, let's say, increased complexity, that has no automated testing, I think that for a typical company, this is a no-go, right? Nowadays, but it was like this. if the team is not willing to take the operational feedback, I really don't understand like why they would need a more complicated or more complex or self-healing environment that the application would be running inside of. So like a lot of these problems arise from the let's say lack of the operational part, because if you are just a developer, things are much simpler than if you are at least speaking to what is happening in your production, right? I can just say that as of course this approach doesn't scale. For example, the company has some kind of annual upgrades, and each upgrade meant that there was a lot of manual work to update manually all those customizations that were specific to customers, and they were tracking that, for example, each year this process is taking longer. But at the same time, I need to mention that the company was also growing, so there were more customers. So maybe it was on a similar level, but at least it was not scaling as far as we know or expect typically nowadays.
Now, you mentioned that Company A had attempted to use Docker, but it seems they have misunderstood fundamental container concepts that are crucial in Kubernetes environments. What specific container anti-patterns did you observe in their implementation?
So maybe this is a point that I've seen in a lot of adoption, because typically you mimic your VM or virtual machine approach to the first Docker container that you create, right? So basically they've created a Docker image with everything inside it. So you can imagine PHP, Apache, Redis, Elasticsearch, everything running inside a single Docker image. And as long as it gets hard to build, you can imagine, of course, now you understand, okay, I need something smarter to work with the image. And given that there were some limitations and some different like problems with mounting volume to the Docker from the Windows, they've come up with the FTP solution. So they bundled FTP server inside of the container, and the developers could upload the files, like the files that they were working with, through FTP, or maybe even mount it as a FTP there inside Windows, something like this, and work inside of the container and test there. So this is very disconnected from what you would expect. And of course, the container was, let's say, heavyweight, so it resembles probably much more a typical virtual machine than anything else. And I think that even the developers didn't quite understood the difference between the container and the VM or some vagrant that there were some experiments before it.
Given these challenges, you created a proof of concept with Kubernetes and cloud native tooling. Walk us through your solution, particularly how you used Helm charts, GitLab CI, and Argo CD to create a proper cloud native platform.
So in this case, I've asked myself, how can I help, and uh, where do people typically waste time? And of course, like every manual step in this pipeline is redundant. So the end goal was to commit, do nothing else, and everything gets built in the GitLab CI pipeline for you. So basically what you need to build is, let's say, our pipelines in the GitLab repository that are building containers. Actually, each container for a different variation of the service. The service was split to several containers. All the dependencies were built as a separate containers, as you would imagine. I've added some steps to check the quality of code. So, for example, PHP linting was introduced to track at least some number of warnings, etc. We needed to discuss the configuration, because previously, of course, the configuration was inside a PHP file baked in, kind of. We needed to move it to the environment variables, for example. And the installation in Kubernetes was done through the Helm charts, which are probably golden standard, I would say, right now. Argo CD was deployment tool back then. So I've also needed to create some separate Git repositories that will just monitor what is happening on the Kubernetes cluster and deploy it with some YAML version change, etc. So at the end, from the developer perspective, it really looked like that I've committed my PHP code, and in some environment, I will get a URL after 2 minutes or so that my changes are deployed to, completely separate from other branches, etc., etc. Like I would say that this is a standard and not a big deal.
After your initial Kubernetes prototype, you expanded the solution to handle customizations. How did you leverage cloud native concepts like GitOps and CI/CD pipelines to manage the complexities of customer specific deployments?
So we can imagine that what I was just now talking about was, let's say, the core component, but the core component was not evolved much, as I explained, because typically they were doing the customizations for the specific customers. Mostly, there was the team was spending the most time there. So when I was in the phase that I had the application core running like this, I was able to build a Docker image specific to each customer with this customization on top. And you can really imagine that I started like from the Docker file that was taking the core image, throwing in some PHP extra files layer over it, and then running this in through GitLab pipeline, through Argo CD commit, and in some Kubernetes cluster and some special environment after it. So if I would continue in the example from the previous discussion, you could get, let's say, 20 different URLs, each specific for that customer. Maybe I need to mention that the core had a single Git repository. Each customer had typically its own SIM repository. So you could commit to either one of those, and you could get the result, the updated core and customer repositories at some environments. So it was very smooth, I would say. And for example, one of the, let's say, surprising benefit would be that you can see that some customer environments are not starting after your core change, etc.
Despite creating what many in the Kubernetes community would probably consider a technically superior solution, in the end, it wasn't adopted. What resistance did you encounter from developers when trying to transition them to container-based workflows?
hmm Well, this is the failure part of my story, to be honest. So you can imagine that when I've created everything around this, the company B team that was kind of used to it adopted it right away, and they saw some they even didn't see any benefit in it because they thought, okay, this is a standard. We have it in other projects, right? So not a big deal, right? But company A was struggling to adopt it. And when I discussed this more in depth, I've understand that, for example, the Docker image that they presented, they don't use it much, right? Because they still have an installation of PHP with maybe some debugging, etc., on their own laptop. They have some custom built environment. Of course, each one was snowflake-ish on for each laptop, something like this. And I've understood, okay, they don't trust Docker at all at that point. So I understood that I was trying to break in some kind of prison, or I mean, by this analogy that the team was already declining the Docker images before I've entered the competition, so to say. So now I'm bringing something much more advanced, much more complicated, that might have some value because there are no complaints that the end value is not there, not at all. It was all about that it's very hard to understand. There are too many moving parts. It is taking too long to build an image and test it like there, etc., etc., etc. So if you lose the local control that you have, you build remote, you need to understand or you need to moreover trust that on the remote something good is happening, even though you are, for example, responsible for handing over the patch to the customer yourself, etc. It's just very hard psychologically to switch. Maybe this is internally some switching from a small team to some larger team, and if you are if you don't trust that the supporting team, it just can't work this way. So I was trying to onboard the developers from company A to this model, and it was not successful.
Apart from, or we could say beyond developer resistance, what management and customer factors complicated the adoption of your Kubernetes platform and cloud native delivery approach?
Mhm. Here I need to again say that I was not that familiar with companies A's approaches or some decisions made in the past, so they might have been viable. But for example, I've multiple times wanted to break the logic of running the website application on the Windows servers, because I have very bad experience with them personally, move them to Linux or something like in this direction, and I was always declined. And now I think that I've understood that the problem is not around technical part at all. The problem was that the IT managers or IT gentlemen at the customer side were not familiar with Linux. So the company was running mostly on Microsoft tooling, and it was very hard to onboard to something else because they also made their customers follow this principle. So, for example, this is, let's say, one explanation when it was like naturally breaking up, because now when you have Kubernetes and Docker and other technologies that just built on Linux, even though there are some versions for Windows, it's just not the same, or the benefit at least is not the same. So if you are trying to advocate for a different stack altogether, you have already a problem at day one. And now imagine that the company A has literally no cloud footprint. And I mean that, in these years, in this century, it's very hard to understand. I even heard a story that because the city where the server room was hit by the flooding the other day, they really needed to get the servers out when the building was flooded, so they bolted the servers outside, etc. And I don't know, maybe it has changed since then, but at least at my time, it's the company was not even moving to any form of experimentation or adoption partially of the cloud for some services, which is again probably very different from what you see outside of the Czech Republic. I would say that if you make the number of implementations, like the one-off handoff to the customers, one-off developments for the customers, your primary success key, and you evaluate the team for the long term just on this single metric, this is what you get. So you get a team that is very performant in this, but that is not willing to look for the number of bugs that they produce with the deployment, with the new upgrade patch, etc. And unless there is some significant pushback from the customer that is large, it's not a, let's say, significant metric. I mean the number of bugs. So it was very much aligned with the company A's culture, I would say. Even though I again really need to emphasize that it seems maybe critical, but I really think that this is a viable approach, and I don't mean this with any disrespect. So if you enter this story of merger in some kind of inferior position, and your company is being merged into a larger one, it's very easy to understand who is in charge.
The article title mentions FTP beating GitLab commit to Argo CD. In your view, was this truly about the technical superiority of Kubernetes and cloud native tools, or were there other factors that were more significant?
Well, it was a cultural and organizational issue mostly. I think that we are currently even in the, let's say, scale that the technical part was not significant, even I would say not like 10% of the problem. So if your customers are just onboarded for a long time on a different technology, this single thing is hard to break, takes years probably to break. If you would like to offer them some best solution to work with, it's probably not that they would need to reinstall their Windows server to Linux in the first place, right? So even though you say, okay, we have a new version, I don't know, or how would you like to promote it, it requires you to learn 10x technologies in the cloud native, even though you might be more valuable as for your future employer. Probably you won't do it at your current one, something like this. So any change, I think, requires a lot of effort, a lot of advocating. And if you just stumble upon an environment that is running in really a different game at so many levels, it can take years to change. So I mean that it really is that you need to decide if this is worth your effort, if you think that even you are from your position are able to influence things as much, if you would like to go in the direction, or of course you can merge and you can maybe get on the train that the company is already running. Why not? Both of these approaches, I think, are very viable, and I really have no objection in the money of them. So maybe just to explain that the context in the Czech Republic especially is that the technical hypes don't matter much, even from the customer perspective. I mean that they typically don't have as much money as people are used to in the US. Software as a service is not a big thing. And typically they compare the free solutions of Apple's, Google's, etc., to your custom made with just a handful of people. So it's very different experience if you have a limited team and you are building a product that is starting from 10 years 10 years old or something like this.
It's good to know that the Czech Republic is hype proof. People are being sensible about how they're approaching technology. That's good to know. But looking back at this experience, what key lessons would you share with platform engineers who might face similar situations when trying to introduce Kubernetes and cloud native practices to organizations that are using legacy systems?
Mhm. Well, I think that the team to be ready and to be willing to learn and team to be willing to move is absolutely essential. If you would like to have the change, the team really needs to understand that there is some problem to solve. If the team seems confident that they don't have any problem, they just like what they have, there is no problem to solve, right? So this is first of all. Secondly, the manager or the management in general needs to support you. And this is a change and it needs to be advocated on all levels. So if you are trying to bring a change and management makes it like voluntary, you are already a second grade citizen, I would say, because why would I change if I am again not seeing the problem? I'm happy my manager is not pushing me, even not advocating for the solution. So if you approach your manager and he says something like, yeah, that's nice, this is definitely like not sufficient, not at all. You really need to maybe sell the thing to him first, and then he needs to be onboarded, then he needs to help with this effort. Otherwise, it's just, yeah, we do have this nice thing and we can bury it any minute because we are not using it actually, right? Of course, to check if your customers are ready for the solution in this broader sense is also essential, especially if you are not running something like software as a service that you can operate yourself and you are willing to push the product to the customers. If they are able to do it and operate it or not, this is go, no-go questions. And again, any change requires significant effort here. So I think that probably all of these three points I got wrong at that experience. So if you are not advocating on all these levels for some time, I think that you are not guaranteed to succeed with basically any change. And it doesn't matter much if you are willing to switch a version of the operational system, if you are willing to introduce something as a platform or anything in this direction.
You closed your article with an example about a top accounting software company that's still using 32-bit solutions despite customer needs for more memory. How does this relate to your cloud migration experience? And what broader pattern does it highlight about the challenges of modernizing to cloud native architectures?
hmm So maybe just to get back to the example that the company with the 32-bit solution is having some kind of, let's say, hard limit that you can open an Excel that has 3 gigs, something in memory, and you are not able to get past this like anyhow. And this is very interesting because, you know, when you open a file, it is zipped. Typically nowadays, you have no idea how large it will be in the memory, etc. So it is very typically it's very unexpected when it happens, and people are not aware when it happens. But if you reach to the support of this company, they can clearly like say, yeah, this is the core of the problem. Yeah, we have this limitation, and we are not planning to do anything at all with it because our software is just built this way. You can like stay. We can help you with because we have some tooling, for example, to split the large files. But that's it. And I think that this approach is very valid because if you are having a pension in a few years and you would like to for your company to go out of business in a few years, yeah, why not? This is a very viable situation. And if you are able to clearly communicate this to your customers, maybe they are fine with it. They can just overcome the differences. Why not? But typically, I think that this is like very well illustrates that it is hard to make a transition even at these levels, because you can imagine, why don't they compile the software with something for 64 bits, right? They are just decided not to do it. So even the technical part might be, I guess, simple. It's not about this technical part. It's also about your customers, what they are expecting, if they are mostly fine with your expectations. And of course, that any change from of these major areas is very expensive for your software company. So I mean that if you have any outdated solutions, and we all do have them in our daily jobs, right? There are some limitations. If you are aware of them and the company is like voicing where are the boundaries, I'm completely fine with it. I don't mean that pushing every company to modernize or to bring something new is necessary at all. And yeah, you can just plan that in 5 years we will switch this technology, this product for something else that may be more modern, have different approaches, and we will need to re-implement it. Why not? So when I get back to the like discussion for the Czech Republic, you can't compare to the Googles and Apples, right, of the world, especially here. So a lot of the ERP, for example, systems here are custom built, maybe from the 90s. You can imagine that if the company is large in the Czech Republic, software house, it has no more than 100 engineers for everything. And the software does all that you need in the company. So accounting, sales, manufacturing, it has some e-commerce sites, reporting, just you name it, everything around it. And you develop it maybe for decades. You've probably modernized it already several times, but still you are nowhere near some, let's say, user experience of anything modern. And that's fine. And this is how it is. And there will be, of course, some products dying out. There will be some coming maybe up in the future, but that's just how it is. And I don't think that the customers need to be anyhow angry about this fact. So this is fine. This is the major maybe a message of what I wanted to say, that you don't need to move to the cloud native architecture at all if you decide so, and if you are transparent about it, if it brings some benefits for you, yeah, why not to consider it?
I really like that, and I think it's nice because it's, sort of the idea of start with the end in mind, like famous, quote around building objectives. But based on the objectives that you have, what kind of systems are you going to need in order to achieve them? And that should be fitting, like you said, be transparent about it, make an honest choice. I think there's a lot to be said for that in a world where there is so much hype, and sometimes people feel that there's pressure to start using something when perhaps maybe it's answering a question that nobody asked. I also think you've done a very interesting roundabout sort of promotion for the Czech Republic as a country that we should be more interested in terms of how technical decisions are made. And so that, vendors that are out there might have a better approach in terms of really responding to issues that people are having, and how to best have those conversations. I was lucky enough to be in the Czech Republic last year, and now I really hope to be able to go back again this year. To finish up though, for those that are working in environments resistant to Kubernetes and cloud native adoption, what practical advice would you give for making incremental progress with containerization while at the same time respecting existing constraints, such as some of the ones you've mentioned already?
Start small. I would say this is absolutely number one, and you need to have some level of expertise in house. Definitely, these are the two most vital parts of the message. So we can imagine that building any form of container in any technology is the first step. Then you need to understand how it gets run in any form of environment. I think that people tend to see some shortcuts. Okay, I don't know, let's spin a GKE cluster with autopilot, right? And I just throw away some YAML to have it inside of Kubernetes. This just don't work much, because once you've encountered the first problem, you have very limited debugging experience there. You have a problem, even though you have hired, for example, some fancy consultant and you are paying him a lot of money, etc. It doesn't work. So people typically think nowadays that, it's easy to run an application, I don't know, on Linux server. Every IT person with the operations background can do it. But they very underestimate how much harder it is to run it inside containers in any direction, either Docker Swarm, Docker Compose, Kubernetes. It is very different. So what I would say is that the operational parts needs to be in-house, at least from like 80%. And if you are not willing to make this investment and also this transition of, let's say, mental model, don't go there. Just stay where you are, or maybe pay someone to do it for you, but completely outsource this part. This would make definitely sense because one of the key takeaways from like my story is also that I cannot find any rational motivation for the team in company A to improve in these areas if they don't have any operational feedback, any operational experience. Why would you introduce any observability tools if you are not observing? This is a part of some other person's job. So a lot of technologies is completely redundant, but there are very like experienced and perfect developers, I would say, in the Czech Republic. So in the Czech Republic, a lot of companies just develop the software and sometimes are really far from operating it. So yeah, this is part 1 or chapter 1, I would say. And if you are not willing to go to chapter 2 and others, yeah, just stay there. Don't onboard, don't build it. If you will go to chapter 2, you need to do this, let's say, all in.
Now, speaking of doing things that are all in, the last time we talked, you were expecting a baby. How's this round of parenting going?
Yeah, I need to shout out to my wife that without her help, I would be nowhere. Yeah, we are trying. I do have 2 healthy girls. One is currently 6 months old, and she is very. She has a nice voice, especially during the nights. That's all I can say.
It's great. Now, what's next for you?
Well, currently, I'm thinking I might start first open source project of my life that would tackle Postgres configuration. It might be called PG AutoConf, but I'm not sure if I'm willing to start it just yet. So maybe stay tuned, and hopefully there will be some development here.
What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Definitely LinkedIn. Just ping me there. I'm there frequently.
It's what worked for us. And that being said, it was wonderful having you back for a second episode with us on Cube FM. Wishing you nothing but the best with both your personal and professional projects, and looking forward to hearing about what you decide to do with this Postgres extension. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Much appreciated.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
All right. Cheers.
Bye-bye.